Jonah. Introduction. The book of Jonah is unique among the books of the minor prophets in that it focuses on the actions of the prophet rather than the words of the prophet. The book tells the story of Jonah's response to God's calling to announce his message to a foreign country. Ultimately, the book shows us that God is sovereign and that God is concerned for the well-being of Gentile people beyond the borders of Israel. The book itself gives us no clues as to who the author is. There's information here that could only have come from Jonah himself. But who organised the book into the final form we have it today, we don't know. The first verse introduces us to Jonah as the son of Amittai. Now, although this book itself doesn't give us any real clues about when this prophecy was written, thankfully, Jonah is mentioned elsewhere in the Old Testament. In 2 Kings, we're told that Jonah was a prophet from Gath Hepher, a place 5 kilometers northeast of Nazareth in Galilee. So he was from Israel, the northern kingdom. And he lived at the time of King Jeroboam II, that is 786 to 746 BC. Jonah was called by God to go and preach against Nineveh, the capital of Assyria. Assyria was known for its cruelty in the ancient world, and it was the enemy of Israel. See map 1 for the location of Nineveh. So on hearing God's command to go to Nineveh, Jonah tries to make a run for it. He goes to the seaport of Joppa and he finds a ship headed for Tarshish at the far end of the Mediterranean Sea. God tells him to go east, so Jonah decides to go west. It's a blatant act of disobedience. But it isn't possible to run from God. Jonah is caught up in a violent storm that he knows has been brought about by his own disobedience. In the end, Jonah is thrown overboard to save the ship. Jonah's lifeboat turns out to be a huge fish provided by God. The fish swallows Jonah, and he remains in the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. And there he does some soul searching. His powerful testimony is given in chapter 2. He found himself falling through the water to the seabed. His life was ebbing away. But then he remembered the Lord and he prayed, and God saved him. Finally, at God's command, the fish vomited Jonah onto dry land. At the end of chapter 2, Jonah finds himself on a beach somewhere, back in the land of the living. An outline of Jonah. The book divides into the 4 episodes of the story. So first of all, chapter 1, Jonah runs away from God. Then chapter 2, Jonah's prayer. Chapter 3, Jonah's preaching and Nineveh's response. And then chapter 4, Jonah's anger at the Lord's compassion. Let's look at the exercise on slide 1. Read Jonah chapter 3, verses 1 to chapter 4, verse 1. What is Jonah's message? Why is Jonah unhappy? Please pause the video at this point so that you can answer the question. Read Jonah chapter 3, verse 1 to chapter 4, verse 1. What is Jonah's message? Why is Jonah unhappy? After his major detour in chapters 1 and 2, God again gives Jonah the same command he gave him back in chapter 1, verse 2. the Lord tells Jonah here, verse 2, to go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim the message I give you. So, verse 3, Jonah obeys God and makes the 500-mile journey from Israel to the capital of Assyria, which is described as being a vast metropolis. Jonah takes a journey into the city, verse 4, and he proclaims God's message. 40 more days, and Nineveh will be overthrown. The story then takes a surprising turn. These pagan people listen to Jonah's message. Verse 5, we're told that they believed God. They fasted and put on sackcloth to show that they were genuinely repentant. When news reached the king about Jonah's message, verse 6, he had the same response. He took off his royal robes and put on sackcloth. Rather than sitting on his throne, he sat in the dust. The king took Jonah's message seriously and issued a decree, verses 7 to 9. This came from the very top. All the people were to fast and to wear sackcloth, even the animals. They were to call urgently on God. They were to give up their evil ways and their violence. The king says, verse 9, who knows? God may yet relent and with compassion turn from his fierce anger so that we will not perish. And that's exactly what God did do. Verse 10. He saw what was happening. He saw how the Assyrians were responding to Jonah's message of imminent destruction. He saw how they turned from their evil ways. And he relented, we're told, and did not bring on them the destruction he had threatened. But there was one person who wasn't happy at all with what had happened. Jonah, chapter 4, verse 1. To him, this outcome seemed very wrong. And he became angry, we're told. He was outraged by what had happened. And as we read the rest of chapter 4, we can see that he was angry with God for being so compassionate and forgiving. He clearly wanted God's punishment to fall on Israel's enemies. He's so upset about the situation that he tells God to take his life. But God shows him that he has no right to be angry. Jonah watches from a makeshift shelter outside the city to see what would happen when the 40-day deadline passes. As he does so, God provides him with a leafy plant to grow up over his head to shade him from the sun, to ease his discomfort. Jonah is very happy about this. Then the next day, God provides a worm that causes the plant to wither, and he provides a scorching east wind so that Jonah feels faint in the heat. Jonah's very angry about this new turn of events. But the plant, the worm, the wind, they all come from God's hand. Jonah hadn't tended the plant or made it grow. It was God who caused it to spring up overnight and to die overnight. God was sovereignly in control of its life and its death. And it was the same with Nineveh, God says. Clearly, Jonah was more interested in his own comfort than in the well-being of the people of Nineveh. But God had a great concern for this great city of Nineveh. 120,000 people who were lost without him. People who couldn't tell their right hand from their left. Jonah is shown that God's compassion extends to other nations and not just to the people of Israel. Well, finally, let's think about the importance of the book of Jonah for Christians. The book of Jonah shows us a number of things about God. First of all, it shows us that Yahweh is the Lord of all nations. He's not some local limited deity. He's not just the God of the land of Israel. He's the God of the whole world. Secondly, and related to this point, this book shows us God's concern for Gentiles. Now, that's a theme that we find elsewhere in the Old Testament, not least in God's promise to Abraham that all peoples on earth would be blessed through him. In the New Testament, that concern for Gentiles would come to a climax in the Great Commission of Matthew 28, where Jesus' first followers are told to make disciples of all nations. It was part of God's plan from the very beginning that Gentiles should be included, believing Gentiles should be included in the people of God. But that was only made possible by the blood of Jesus on the cross, that paved the way for a new covenant where people from every nation could be part of God's new covenant people. God's concern here for the people of Nineveh is just a small echo of that coming day when the dividing wall between Jews and Gentiles would finally be broken down because of the gospel of Jesus. Thirdly, the book shows us that God is the Lord of nature. He controls the wind and the waves. He controls the storm. He controls everything from large sea creatures to tiny worms. He causes plants to grow and wither. He controls the weather. He's the Lord of land and sea. He's the Creator God who controls all that He's made. Many hundreds of years later, people would witness the same thing in the person of Jesus. Apart from witnessing many other miracles over nature, they would see him calm a raging storm with just a word. His disciples were terrified by his power. They ask each other, "Who is this?" Even the wind and the waves obey him. We can only draw one conclusion. This is God himself. Finally, in the New Testament, Jesus compares and contrasts himself to the prophet Jonah. When Jesus was asked for a miraculous sign to prove that he really was who he said he was, he points his critics to his coming resurrection from the dead. He compares his 3 days in the tomb with Jonah's 3 days in the belly of a fish. Jesus also tells them that the response of the people of Nineveh to Jonah's preaching stood in stark contrast to the response of Israel to the many prophets God had sent them. Jesus warns his listeners that the men of Nineveh will stand up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the preaching of Jonah. Something greater than Jonah is here.